Welcome to the Healing for the Soul podcast, where we dive deep into the unknown that is all things divine. My name is Heather, and I'll be your guide as we explore practical ways to deepen your connection to the superconscious, develop your spiritual gifts, and learn how to break down the barriers that sabotage us from experiencing our heaven on earth within right now. So get comfortable, grab something to jot your aha moments down on, surround yourself in a ball of white light that is source consciousness, and prepare to enter into a whole new world. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Healing for the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Heather, and today I want to talk about a concept I like to call identity entanglement, and how it is the very reason it can feel like our manifestations and our dreams are impossible to reach, or are so far away at times. Identity entanglement is made up of external conditioning that is placed onto us from society, parental expectations, and influences of our world, along with unresolved emotional or mental trauma. The best way to look at this from a spiritual lens would be seeing this identity entanglement as our ego. The ego is an illusion of a false or separate self from God or consciousness. The ego resides in the solar plexus. And when the ego is not in balance, or in other words, not in alignment with heart-centered consciousness, it ends up being run by our lower self or our out of balance lower chakras. The lower self or the lower chakras consists of the root chakra, the sacral chakra, and the solar plexus. For context, if I say these chakras are out of balance, it is because they have not been attuned or anointed by the heart center. The heart center holds the key to the frequency of unconditional love, which is why the heart center can also be looked at as Christ consciousness or soul or infinite spirit consciousness. For our chakras to be attuned to the heart center, it means that you have awakened the heart center as the boss, if you will, meaning that you have decided that you will only tolerate yourself to be acting out of the frequency of love. And if any frequency lower than this tries to come up, it will not be able to go unnoticed or unchecked by the gates of the heart. The problem is that most of us are operating from our ego, and we won't even realize it. I have been a consciousness leader for 4 years now, and even I have fallen subject to entertaining my ego over these last few years. And the challenge comes from the fact that I was completely unaware that it was even happening. The ego is the personality or personal will. Personality and personal will are illusions in and of themselves. If you think about it constructively, we are not who we think we are. Most of us believe that we are made up of our likes, dislikes, opinions, and morals of what we think to be right and wrong in the world. But if this were true, why are these things so inconsistent and temporary? I know that my opinions, likes, and dislikes have changed and evolved 100 times over my 26 years of life. And all of that evolution has been rooted in survival and a need for acceptance from others. Our personality or personal will can only survive if we are subscribing to the core fears that all humans have or will likely experience at some point in time, which are fears of rejection, loneliness, embarrassment, physical pain, and extinction. When you think of what heaven might be like, what comes to mind? I know growing up as a Baptist Christian that my idea of heaven was absolute bliss and no more pain and suffering. However, I couldn't get behind the idea that only perfect people who followed all of the rules were going to get into heaven and the rest would burn in the fiery pits of hell. Mostly because I knew I wasn't perfect and would never be able to live up to those standards of Christianity, nor was basically everyone I knew and loved. Nobody I was surrounded with growing up fit into the going to heaven box. And it was for this very reason that at the young age of 12, I knew something was not right about the religion of Christianity, and I made the decision to leave the church. Thankfully, because I was raised in two households as a result of divorced parents,
I had more freedom to make these types of decisions when I was this young. After my father passed in 2018, I slowly began to awaken to my mediumship abilities, and my spiritual awakening journey unknowingly had begun. From 2018 into the end of 2020, I was in the heart of my dark night of the soul portion of my awakening. The dark night of the soul is when everything you know to be true begins to fall apart at uncontrollable speeds. For me, this consisted of losing my father, who was the source of my codependency, which was followed by a traumatic divorce after just becoming a new mother. As you can imagine, this forced me into a situation where everything I had once relied on was gone, and I was truly, for the first time in my life, on my own with no choice but to take control over my own life. Speaking of this notion of having no choice, this is actually not entirely accurate. It was actually the decision of taking control over my own life as being the only choice I would entertain that I realized for the first time, as humans, we do have a say in what happens next in our reality. It was in the darkest moment of my dark night of the soul experience that I was faced with a very important question. I was riddled with stress, depression, and anxiety. My body was shutting down, and I was doing everything I could to numb out and avoid my emotional turmoil. Until one night, I laid my daughter down for bed, who was almost 1 year old at the time, and I was in my room feeling the dreadful feelings of how my life was falling apart, coming up again. I did what I would always do at that time, and I began to prepare to smoke weed as quickly as I could in my attempt to outrun these remarkably uncomfortable and terrifying feelings of sadness and loneliness. However, that night, something different happened. As I had just finished smoking, I felt my heart beating out of my chest. My father had just passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, and I heard a voice tell me I was going to follow in his fate if I continued down the road I was walking on. I heard a voice that spoke to me clearly. This voice, I know without a shadow of a doubt today, was my father speaking to me. The voice said, "You have a choice. You can keep doing what you were in the habit of doing and let your daughter watch you die, or you can make a new decision and let your daughter watch you heal." I was in complete and utter shock of what I had just heard, and in that moment, it was a no-brainer that my choice was going to be to heal and make sure my daughter would not be left without me in this world. It was in this immediate new decision that I had made that my intuition and internal guiding system kicked in and took the wheel for me. I was downloading all of the right questions to ask for the superconscious to guide me right out of the dark night of the soul and into my heaven on earth. Which brings me back to the question I asked a few moments ago on what might come to mind for you when you think of heaven. Today, I have learned that heaven and hell are not places we enter into after death, in which that is decided based on how good or bad we did in terms of following some set of arbitrary rules and conditions to decide our fate of golden roads or pits of fire. But rather, heaven and hell are but only states of being that we as spiritual beings having a human experience have the ability to experience right now here on earth. Experiencing heaven on earth comes from allowing and training your current level of consciousness to ascend from the level of ego, personal will, fear, and illusions of hell on earth into the heart-centered consciousness, Christ consciousness, and the God self. It is my understanding, which comes from developing my mediumship abilities over the last 4 years, that all of the stories of light versus dark, good versus evil, angels versus demons, and so on, that can be depicted in almost all spiritual texts, such as the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, are only allegorical and metaphorical stories that have been created in order to help us understand how the human experience is working for or against us. For example, the story of Moses parting the Red Sea is only a metaphorical story of how God can move mountains when you trust in him to set you free from your demons. Moses had a lisp, and his ego or his lower self told him he would not be able to speak to the village or help them because they would not listen to him, and told him things like, "Who are you to lead these people to safety?" Had he listened to his lower self or ego, he would have not been able to perform the miracles he did and allow the Red Sea to be parted to guide his people to safety, just in time for the sea to go back to normal to crush the enemies. In this story, Moses represents ourselves. His people represent his righteous intentions and desires. The enemies represent the illusions of fears, doubts, worries, insecurities. And the Red Sea represents the miracles God can perform if you stop entertaining the enemy or demons of illusion and put your faith into Him to guide you into your heaven on earth, where the streets are paved with gold, life is eternal, and miracles are around every corner. This always reminds me of the Nickelback song, If Everyone Cared, where they sing what I would refer to as being the true gospel of spirit, saying, if everyone cared and nobody cried, if everyone loved and nobody lied, if everyone shared and swallowed their pride, then we'd see the day when nobody died. The story of Moses is one that is very resonant to the story of the Bhagavad Gita, where the prince must go to war with his people, and he doesn't want to have to kill his people, but they have turned into savages. And what I would consider to be his spiritual counselor tells him that he must kill them to save the kingdom. The prince again would represent ourselves. The savages would represent the illusions of the ego and personal will, which is selfish, fearful, and barbaric. The fight would represent his faith in the infinite spirit to save the kingdom and restore the peace to his palace. And the spiritual counsel would represent our higher self showing us the way. Speaking of the way the higher self is leading us to, you may notice a pattern of the representation of humans from these stories will almost always have to do the very thing they would never do in order to reach salvation, such as Moses having to override his insecurities, and the prince having to stop entertaining his demons and stop letting his illusions and personal will be more seductive than his God self. To clarify something I have a feeling might come up when hearing these analogies presented this way, as I know before I really understood what this was teaching, I would feel overwhelmed with this thought that the ascension process was going to be quite literally a terrible and challenging experience. This is true in the sense that you will inevitably have to do things you would never have done before, or may have thought you would never do in order to have a new experience. Or, as Einstein would say, breaking free from insanity will require you to do something different, as it is insane to expect different outcomes without different actions being taken. But you won't literally need to go to war or kill any other living beings, such as being depicted in the stories above, to change your reality. It is from my understanding that these are not real stories that actually happened exactly the way they are described, but rather they are metaphorical stories that help us to paint a picture of the journey we will go through within the mind as we ascend from the ego into the heart. We will have to slay the enemy of the egoic illusions with our only weapon of faith in God or the infinite spirit to restore the years the false illusions have eaten and restore us into overflow and plentiful as the promises of the Garden of Eden are fulfilled, just on the other side of breaking free from the illusions of hell on earth. As we transcend our level of consciousness to be in alignment with the heaven on earth that God has promised as our divine birthright to each and every one of us. So you might be wondering what this process of ascension might look like. The truth is, this process is going to be extremely unique and different for each individual. However, at Soul Healer Institute, the curriculum I teach consists of 3 phases. The first phase of the process consists of assessing where someone is currently at versus where they want to be. I call this phase direction. Here is where we need to figure out how clear our visions are and begin the process of eliminating visions that are not coming from the heart-centered consciousness or the will of love. The second phase of this process is called decondition. This is where we will get up close and personal with our ego, fears, insecurities, and illusions that we are aware and unaware of, shining the light onto these illusions and taking the time necessary to acknowledge, embrace, and accept what is, and reparent or retrain the ego to follow the commandments of the heart, which will allow the ego to go from being and feeling separate from the God self and begin integrating all of you back into unison of the heart center. The final phase of the process is, of course, only the new beginning of my students getting to live from their heaven on earth within. I like to call this phase balance. This is where the gap from where we have been and are currently versus where we want to be begins to close, and the bridge to the Garden of Eden is being built one day at a time. This is the part of the process where the student is finally ready to no longer entertain the ego and is taking active steps to make brand new habits and decisions that support their vision of heaven on earth. And the result of this is the old reality begins to crumble away under grace and imperfect ways, while the new reality, where all their righteous needs and desires begin to be made manifest with ease and joy. I have spent the last 4 years on this very journey myself and credit all of my quantum shifts, inner healing, and achievements, such as getting nominated and recognized as Power Healer from On Point Global News, and watching my first published ebook become an international bestseller within 24 hours of being available. Not to mention all of the careers, abundance, healing, and power my clients have been able to step into and create over these last few years. That has all come from the knowings of these spiritual truths and laws I share within this space. It is my greatest hope that the words spoken today will resonate deeply into your hearts so that you are struck with the energy and encouragement to move in ways you have never moved before, so that you too may experience a whole new world. I do hope that if you are enjoying the content you are receiving, that you will share this message with others and that you are sure to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of my self-healing and manifestation adventures that are led by the superconscious, so that you too can apply this information into your own life for easier transition into the realms of higher frequency.